In this video, we're going to be discussing the importance of trigger control for both accuracy as well as safety. The other day, I took a relative of mine to the range who is an occasional shooter like many people are that go to the range. And I brought 3 pistols with me that day, all of which have different types of triggers. The Striker Fire trigger on the RXM, which comes in just shy of around 4 ounces, the CZ75, which has a double single action, as well as the TSOS, which is a single action, which has a 4-pound trigger pull. And the reason why I did this was I wanted to be able to show the difference between all the trigger pulls that are out there, but show them that you could still be accurate with all of them. And what I did when I started the session was I took all 3 guns out and basically planted a whole bunch of rounds in the 10 ring. Right in front of him, picking up all 3 different handguns. And what I wanted to do was to show him how that works in succession and how you can train around this to become better around using trigger pull. Now, when he picked up the gun, as usual, when a lot of people do when they occasionally shoot, is the first rounds tend to be a little bit erratic. And at the end, when I go through what I'm going to go through now with him, the groups tighten up a lot closer into the 10 ring. So what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about what I talked about in that session, and then ultimately things that might be able to help you with trigger control as well. Now, the first thing is, why are we talking about trigger control? Because trigger control is the most important factor in your handgun when it comes to 2 things, safety and accuracy. Now, trigger control is 90% mental, which is just like golf. So if you've ever played golf before, you probably heard people say, hey, golf is 90% mental. It is. So is trigger control when it comes to firing handguns. A lot of people think you have to have a certain strength or factors of that nature to handle handguns, when the reality is 90% of it is mental. So you need to learn how to control the mental side of handgun shooting so that you can ultimately empty out into the 10 zone as well with any one of the handguns you're shooting. Now, the first topic around trigger control is a fairly simple one if you've been shooting for a while, but it's around safety. And it's a very simple concept, which is you keep your finger outside of the trigger guard until on target and ready to fire. This is a key principle. If you've shot guns for a long time, you know what I mean. The good news is a lot of the new handguns that are coming out, they'll have little index pads to help you kind of rest your finger on there. But really, this should be a muscle memory reflex anyways. If you're experienced or you pick up a handgun, I always tell people, the minute you pick up a handgun and hold it and put it on target, your finger should always be indexing on the frame, never on the trigger. Only come onto the trigger after you are on target and you're safe to fire. And then at that point, you can index down. This is a safety factor, and it becomes a trigger control and a memory function. And that's what you want to do, is every time you pick up a gun, whether you're thinking about it or not, consciously or unconsciously, your finger should always be resting on the side of the frame. Now, the second part, which is the one we're going to talk most about today, has around accuracy. And if you've ever seen one of these handgun correction charts, basically what this does is it shows when you're shooting what you're typically doing wrong with your grip and your trigger control based upon the zones in which that you are hitting the target. Now, in most cases, what people do is they tend to shoot in the zones around here, which we're going to be talking about in a moment. And this is where people are jerking or slapping the trigger or breaking down on it or anticipating the shot and thereby jerking the gun down and firing into these zones. Now, there are other exceptions where people are hitting in other areas or erratically, which we're going to be talking about in a moment. But if you find yourself shooting and hitting consistently in these specific areas, then you know exactly what it is of the types of trigger pull that you're doing and how it's impacting your firing. Now, the idea behind trigger control with accuracy is to isolate the action of the trigger. The human grip is developed to be gripping all fingers together. This is how we grew up. This is how we were born. This is how we do almost everything else. It is a full muscle memory. What we're trying to do, however, now is to isolate the action of the trigger from the grip of the hand. So the motion taking place with the trigger should be independent of the hand. The reason why this is so hard inherently for people, especially people that don't shoot often, is they want to jerk together, because this is where the muscle memory comes in. The second part of trigger accuracy and trigger control comes to the goal of trying to pull straight to the rear. So when you're trying to pull straight to the rear, you're going to notice something about the human finger, which is the human finger is hinged, right? It's bending. So the goal is, a lot of times when people shoot, they're jerking this way or slapping down, because that is the motion or the anchor in which the way the finger moves. What you ultimately want to be doing is moving the finger in a way where you're moving the trigger back, straight to the rear, not sideways, not pushing, but moving it back to the rear. And then the other part of that is to develop a constant and steady pull of your trigger. So slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I'm sure you've heard that many times. All my guns, by the way, were safety checked before this video. So you're going to see a lot of people when they shoot, for example, you're going to see them come onto the trigger and jerk it real fast, right? It's just a natural impulse, and then of course they're jerking hard in anticipation of the recoil, etc. So they're going like that. And the reality is, they should only be pulling slightly more than the weight of the trigger pull. So in this case, we have an RXM that has a trigger pull of just under 4 ounces. Now what I'm doing here is I want to pull on that trigger smooth and steady until it breaks without over pulling on the handgun. And that's one of the tricks as well, is when you learn your trigger pull of the handgun you're firing, you want to make sure you are consistently pulling only to the weight that breaks that trigger and no more. Now, when we talk about trigger pull, we need to also understand, you're going to be hearing terms like stages of travel, right? Pre-travel, break, over travel, reset. The easiest way to understand all of these are the following. The first one is, when we talk about pre-travel, we're talking about the travel the trigger takes when you come up to the wall. And basically that is the pre-travel, or the take-up, if you will. And so in this case, we're going to be taking up here, and then the break is where the sear releases. And then the over travel is the distance between when the sear releases and when the trigger goes back. And then the reset is the distance where it comes through where the sear resets. And you're going to see a lot of people when they target shoot, they're going to be shooting, and you'll notice that they slowly reset, pause, and then fire again. And a lot of people do this for accuracy, because what they're trying to do is eliminate the pre-travel that they have to make each time. There are other people that teach when you shoot that you should always do pre-travel to be consistent with your shooting. So either way, those are the 4 stages that you're going to do when you shoot. Now, if you've got, for example, a single double action like I have here with the CZ, you're going to have 2 types of trigger pulls. You're going to have the take up, which is the double action. You're going to have the wall, the over travel, and then you're going to have the reset. And then what happens is each time you fire it, it resets to a single action, which means the pre-travel changes, the break is there, and then you can run the system again. So those are one of the main differences you're going to see there as well. With the single action, one of the reasons why the people like the 1911s are, there are single action. It's only cock and lock. So what you're going to have here is you're going to have the pre-travel, the break, which usually is very clean on a 1911, and then the reset. And this is one of the reasons why people really like 1911s when they shoot them, is because the triggers on these usually are very, very nice. Even now with the budget ones like the TSOS here, it comes with an excellent trigger with a lot less grit, a lot less pre-travel, and then the resets are very crisp and clean. And that's what people ultimately want when they're dealing with the stages of travel. So what are some of the major trigger pull types? Some of the issues that you see people having when they're dealing with trigger pull. The first one, as I talked about, is the hit zone where people are jerking or slapping the trigger. Very common. People come in, if you have not practiced a lot, you're going to see them doing the same thing, which is a very rapid trigger pull. Now notice what happens to the muzzle of the gun when I'm doing that. It's pulling down into the left. That's why you typically see hit zones where people are doing that. Conversely, if you have people that are very good at target shooting, you're going to see them staging. So what they're doing is they're working through the functions of the trigger very slowly and very methodically on the take-up and staging their shots. And they're doing that for accuracy. Now, the reality for self-defense, you're probably not going to be doing any types of staging. You're going to be doing something around either slapping the trigger if you're over-anticipating it, or hopefully what you're doing is you're going to be doing a slow and smooth and methodical trigger pull at just above the weight of the trigger. The other part of this has to do with trigger placement. You're going to be hearing a lot of people say, well, you know what, you need to either have the trigger on the pad of the finger or the tip of the finger or the knuckle. And you're going to hear people talk about this all the time, about you should always have, for example, your finger, your trigger finger at the pad. The problem with this is there's a lot of handguns out today, and each one of them have a different length of pull. And length of pull is the difference between the back of the grip and the front of the trigger. So everybody's got different hand sizes. First off, I've got an average hand size. So when I hold, for example, the RXM, I can typically get a middle pad hold very comfortably. But if I go down to, for example, a Glock 40, to give you an example, if I look at the difference in length of pull, you can see a considerable difference between the trigger on the and then the trigger on the RXM. And as a result of that, if I hold on here and then put my pad on here, look at where my finger is. It's way outside, right? And of course, a lot of people can shoot this way. Other people will compensate for that by, instead of shooting from the pad on a gun like a Glock 42, they will move it into their knuckle and they will fire this way. Now, some people will say, hey, you're not supposed to do that, right? It should always consistently be by pad. Well, the reality is I've got different types of guns with different types of pull. The most important thing to remember is that the pull is consistently back. So the reality is, if you can do that with your knuckle or your pad, either one will work. The difference is making sure that you train on which one you want to use. So don't let anybody, for example, tell you that, hey, you know what, you're never going to hit anything if you're pulling from your knuckle and not the pad of your finger. When the reality is, if you train, and I've seen a lot of people that can shoot consistently well, both with their pad, the tip, as well as the knuckle, as long as you understand one thing, which is it doesn't matter which part you're touching it with, as long as your trigger pull is consistently back and not away or pushing. And that's one of the things you need to remember about pull dynamics on this. Now, the final thing you're going to hear people say a lot when you start out shooting is surprise breaks. So what they're going to say is, instead of slapping, what I want you to do is I want you to pull the trigger, and I want you to pull it really slow until you're surprised when the gun goes off. And this is actually a great place to start if you start shooting, which is telling people to say pull really slow and let the gun surprise you when it goes off. That'll keep the anticipation and the jerking down. The problem is it doesn't really work well when it comes to rapid firing, because if you're surprising yourself every time the gun goes off, chances are you're not going to be able to do rapid shots in succession well. So if you're going to be using the surprise breaking model, my suggestion is do that to start with, but don't do it all the time, because over time what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to learn your trigger pull, learn what's comfortable in each handgun that you have, and ultimately in the end know when the break is so that it doesn't surprise you, but you can anticipate it without jerking the gun and controlling it. So what are some of the techniques you can use to help yourself do this? Now, one of the age-old ones that I was taught a long time ago was the placing of an empty shell on the front of the slide. So one of the things I did the other day when I took out my friend's son shooting was I noticed he was erratically shooting all over the place. One of the easiest ways to solve that is you take a shell and you place it on the front of the gun. Then I have him hold the gun on target like he typically would, and then I tell them, I want you to pull the trigger, dry firing it, while the shell is on the gun. And then what you do is you reset it, and what I do usually is about 6 or 12 times. I'll have them continue to repeat this motion. The idea is to not disturb the shell on the frame. Now, this is a 10mm shell. It's a little bit longer than a 9mm, but you'll notice when I place it here, the weight of it is at the base of the shell. If you want to get somebody who's really good, then what I usually do is I flip this over so that the weight is actually on top now, which makes it even more destabilized when you're firing to help them control. But basically what I do a lot of times, especially with newer or younger shooters when they come onto the range, is I have them fire erratically the first time. And then what I do is I place the shell on their gun, just like this, and then I let them do 6 to 12 pulls, making sure that the shell doesn't come off or move around. Now what it's also doing is forcing them to see the instability of their trigger control action to determine whether or not they're in control. And once they feel comfortable with that, then what I do is I immediately put a round in the slide or in the gun, and then have them fire and say, repeat the same type of motion. And ultimately what that does is it tends to tighten up the groups for a lot of people when they fire. The second thing that I learned a long time ago is, because we talked about before the full grip reflex and the lack of isolation of the trigger finger from the hand, oftentimes what people will recommend that you do, that especially if you're jerking down, is to start removing your lower fingers from your grip hold when you fire the gun. Now, there's a number of different ways you can do this depending upon the gun and your hand size. One of the ways is you can fold your fingers under. You can do either the lowest finger, the pinky finger, or two fingers, and then you can ultimately fire the gun. What you're going to notice is it removes a lot of the jerking down, because you don't have that motion happening now with the hand. Other people will fold their fingers up like this, and I see them firing it this way, or they'll literally hold their fingers out. Now, there are some people, however, out there that recommend, hey, fire it just like this. Just keep your thumb around it and fire it with your trigger finger. The reason why I recommend not doing this typically is because the last thing you want to do when you're firing a handgun is have a destabilized handgun in an unsafe environment. And if you're not comfortable firing this way, what could ultimately happen is the gun could work loose and drop and fall. And if you have that happen, you put yourself and everybody around you in danger. So what I recommend doing, however, is just peeling off a finger or two when you're firing the gun. Fold them under or just hold them out, and then notice what happens with your trigger. Becomes much more stable, right? But you also want to make sure you have enough control that you can safely still fire your handgun. This is another way to be able to help manage your trigger control on your handgun. Now, there are also other mechanisms out there where you can practice, for example, dry firing your handgun. There's other tools out there called like the Mantis X, and you've probably seen these ads out a while. This is a light, but the Mantis X will basically go onto your frame. And what it does is it allows you to use a sensor to be able to determine ultimately not only your aim, but really your trigger control, and allows you to do dry firing in a way similar to what a case would do onto your gun, which is it's showing you the destabilization of your trigger control and your firing, your dry firing, and then allows you to manage off of that. You can also simulate independent trigger control before you, for example, go to bed. So, for example, I know this sounds funny, but I know a lot of people that target shoot that will do this consistently, right? They will do a hard hold in, and they will independently do this. What they're doing is they're developing independent trigger control. They're developing that muscle memory around this. And then the final thing is just to practice. Practice, practice, practice. It's just like golf. It's just like, for example, shooting a handgun. If it's 90% mental, you need to practice and get good at it. So in summary, the most important factors in handgun safety and accuracy is trigger control. It's something you can gain, you can get good at, you can train on, and you can do a lot of the things that we talked about here. If you want to shoot accuracy, just like in golf, it's 90% mental. You have to overcome the inherent human reflexes and reactions you're going to have when you're firing a gun, and you have to do this consistently and train around it. You need to train your mind and hand how to consistently shoot accurately. You have to be conscious of the factors of what a full grip reflex will do, and how to isolate, and how to manage your fingers and manage your control, and ultimately manage a really good consistent shooting process of pulling the trigger consistently back in any manner or any type of gun that you're firing. And the final thing is practice and learn your trigger actions of each pistol that you fire onto the range. Now, the reason why I brought all three of these guns is for a specific reason. Most people start out with striker fires. It's a very simple one pull back consistent. Now, the safety is built into the trigger, so as a result of that, you're going to typically have a little bit stiffer trigger than a single action gun, but that's because you don't want to have misfires. So this is a really good one to learn on and train on. The reason why I brought a double single action is because it has a much longer take up, but also shows them the ability to get a more refined, accurate shot. So you're going to see a lot of shooters, for example, over the years will graduate from single or striker fires to double single actions. And what this does is it gives you a much longer safety, because your safety really is that first initial double action pull, and then your follow-ups are your single actions. And then of course, if you have time to anticipate your first shot, you don't even have to do your double action at all. You can just cock back and shoot. Now the thing is, if you train really well on using a gun like the CZ here, your double actions, my double action shots are almost consistently as good as my single action shots, and that's what training does. And then the final thing is, the reason why I brought out the Yukon is this is a 10mm Commander style 1911. This has got a lot of kick to it, especially when I'm shooting my hot 10mm out of it. And the reason why I had to shoot this as well is this is arguably the best trigger out there from a single standpoint, single action standpoint. The problem is you're pulling or you're shooting a very powerful round. So a lot of times people will jerk in anticipation of that because they're anticipating the recoil of the 10mm. So that's the other reason why I brought this out the other day when I was shooting and training, because the reality is you need to be able to understand that it's not always the trigger that's the problem, it's your anticipation of the round that you're firing out and the recoil that's going to come your way, and ultimately how to be able to manage around that. So the trick is to practice, to learn, use and understand your trigger charts. If you're sporadically shooting everywhere, start with your trigger fingers, start with the casing on top of the gun, tighten up your groups. And then if you find your groups are consistently hitting in areas around the chart that are not in the middle, then you'll know exactly where are the areas that you need to address and ultimately get a better trigger pull, better performance, and ultimately have a lot more fun shooting. If you have any suggestions or techniques that you use, please mention them in the comments below. And if you like this video or like our channel, please subscribe on YouTube, and thanks for watching.